Hey everybody, this is Dr. Hathcock, and this is the review video for exam 3. Let's see, so before I go into these possible essay topics, just want to remind you that amendments to the Constitution, generally speaking, make their way onto your exam. Let's see, so this time we have the 20th Amendment, which moved Inauguration Day to January the 20th. We'll also have the 21st Amendment, which repealed prohibition. 21st Amendment made alcohol legal again. Some good ways to remember that. The 20th Amendment, January 20th, right? Those numbers kind of add up. Yeah, you got that. That sets Inauguration Day, January the 20th. And then you have to be 21 or older to drink. So the 21st Amendment repeals prohibition. You'll also have to you're going to need to know the presidents through this time. We've got Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge, Herbert Hoover, a massive amount of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and then just a little bit of Harry Truman having to make that decision to drop the atomic bomb on Japan. So know your amendments, know your presidents. Let's go through all this stuff here. So the economy of the 1920s, it was really good. It was growing at a nice steady pace. You had the assembly line where we could make things better, faster, cheaper than ever before. But then in the late 1920s, the stock market, its prices began to shoot like a rocket to the moon. Go back and look at the role of commercial banks, how they were giving those credit margins, those loans for stock purchase, where people could just put a percentage down, say 10% down, and the rest would be a loan. And this allowed people to invest in the stock market, but it also led to stock brokers inflating prices, selling them, as high as they could. Not really selling it based on growth or productivity. It was just based on, these people are suckers and I'm going to take advantage of them. So what that did is that tied people's checking and savings accounts to the whims of the market, its ups and downs. You might also remember that the Republican Party was in control of the 1920s, and it was very friendly to business. So that also helps grow that economy. Also, you have the automobile really taking off in terms of sales. That leads to highways being built, more jobs in things like steel, gas, oil, windshields, all that sort of stuff. Okay, societal change in the 1920s. There was a lot of change coming down in that decade. But go back and look at change as far as things that were happening for women. Go back and look at the flappers, changing ideas around marriage. Kind of be aware of that urban versus rural fight that was taking place. But you also had changes for African Americans. You had, the Harlem Renaissance taking place, more of a standing up, a pride of culture, self-help community type things were breaking out. Tragically, you had the rise of the KKK as well within all that. Just kind of go back and look at how it wasn't just a conservative backlash. It wasn't just racism. It was that, but it was also a conservative backlash against what they saw as a morally declining America. You might also look at the Scopes monkey trial as America's having to come to terms with the role of science and religion in their everyday lives. Let's see, politics in the 1920s, it's all Republican all the time. All the presidents were Republicans. They're very friendly to business. You might also look at the Teapot Dome scandal, what that did to the Harding administration. Hoover's the guy who kind of oversees the beginnings of the Great Depression with the market crash. The causes and problems of the Great Depression. The stock market crash is part of it, but really what happened to the banks, the credit margins, tying people's bank accounts to the ups and downs of the stock market, so that when it crashed, it wiped out banks and it wiped out people's checking and savings accounts. That's a huge part of the problem there. But you might also look at consumer confidence as well as purchasing power, and how those are some of the problems that have to be addressed in the 1930s with the New Deal. Speaking of which, FDR and the New Deal. I don't envy you this, but yeah, you have to go back and look at all that legislation. You're going to have to look at the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Public Works Administration, the Works Progress Administration, the National Youth Administration. Yeah, I'm sorry, but it's what we do, right? It is the New Deal. So go back and look at those programs and what they were trying to do. You might also remember that the first New Deal was about saving the institutions, the banks, the stock market, things like that. The second New Deal was really more focused on helping people live their everyday lives. Things like Social Security, for example, was a big part of the second New Deal. Okay, you need to look at opposition to the New Deal and problems for FDR in his second term. So we talked about a Father Coughlin. He said the New Deal wasn't doing enough. We looked at a Dr. Francis Townsend. He said the New Deal wasn't doing anything for the elderly. He designed the Townsend Plan that said that the elderly should get paid, monthly, like $200 a month, but they had to spend all the money by the end of the month. Kind of leads to Social Security. And we also looked at Senator Huey Long from Louisiana, his share of the wealth program, and he said that the New Deal needed to tax the rich to help pay for all those programs for the poor. So that's all like the opposition to the New Deal that was starting to sort of pop up. And as far as problems for FDR in his second term, I mean, there's literally like the last slide of the New Deal topic. It's problems for FDR. Let's see. He has a UAW strike that he has to deal with. If you go back and look at your notes, you'll see that the businessmen got mad at him for that. Let's see. What else was a problem in his second term? There were some economic problems where like a recession happened because he cut funding to programs. So he had to call Congress into an emergency session to get those programs refunded. So he caused a recession in the middle of the Great Depression. Let's see. He took to the radio and in a fireside chat, he said that the South was the problem facing the country, that the South had to change and had to modernize for the country to get out of the Depression. That caused Southerners to really get mad at him. Let's see. He tried his court packing scheme, which was a really foolish idea. That idea of adding justices to the U.S. Supreme Court. He wanted to add 6 judges to the court. Of course, he would get to pick all those judges, and of course, he would pick people who were friendly to the New Deal. So, yeah, there's that. His court packing scheme. Another problem that emerged was World War II. The fighting broke out in September 1939 in Europe. And right off the bat, Roosevelt wanted the country involved. He believed that the United States should enter into the war. The country did disagree, though, completely. And the country wanted to maintain neutrality. So those are the various problems that were facing Roosevelt in his second term. Okay, the rise of Japan and Nazi Germany in the lead up to World War II. So looking at Japan first, it was really about sort of following that British model. England is an island nation, Japan is an island nation. England in that moment was like the most powerful nation on earth, so the Japanese figured they could do the same thing. The Japanese built a big navy, just like the British. The Japanese began to colonize, just like the British. The Japanese came to believe that they were a superior race of people. They wanted Asia to be controlled by Asians, and that meant war across Asia itself, the Pacific Islands. That meant war with England, France, eventually the United States. You might also look at how China they saw as a solution to their problems. You know that China had everything Japan needed: land, food, resources, all that sort of stuff. Now, looking at the rise of Nazi Germany, as I said in class, it was really about primarily 2 things. The rise of Nazi Germany was about this promise of economic prosperity, as well as anti-Semitism, sort of showing a hatred for Jews. Hitler was promising to return Germany to her former glory through work and by blaming the Jewish people of Germany for the various problems facing that country. You might also recollect how The Nazis were big on a concept called the master race, believing that the Aryans were the most advanced humans. And then you get down to that level where they're talking about subhumans. And, various groups were there: Poles, Gypsies, Slavic people. But the Jews were the lowest of the low in the Nazi pecking order of things. So that belief, which it's a load of BS, but the belief that there is a master race concept and that there are subhumans then leads to the call for the Lebensraum, or the living space, for the Germans. They came to believe that Eastern Europe was controlled by subhumans, so they had the right to go in and attack those areas and conquer them, and basically treat Eastern Europe as a living space for the German Empire. And then the carrying out of the Lebensraum leads to the Holocaust, where you have the labor camps that eventually become death camps. And something in the neighborhood of 6 million Jews are murdered during the Holocaust. So all of that is the lead up to World War II. Okay, Blitzkrieg and the German war effort up to June of 1941. With Blitzkrieg, that three-pronged strategy for attack, invented by Hans Guderian of the German army, you hit your opponent, your enemy, from the air with fighter aircraft. Then you hit your enemy with tanks on the ground, heavy armor, if you will. And then the third step in the strategy is foot soldiers, who come in and take that objective, hill, whatever it might be. So using Blitzkrieg, it was a lightning strike, a lightning attack. This is how the Germans are going to fight World War II. It's moving, it's advancing, it's a quick strike, a quick hit. It's not like getting bogged down or slowing down or attrition, right? That was World War I, the trenches and no mobility. Blitzkrieg is about speed, it's about mobility and keeping the assault going forward. The German war effort up to June of 1941, it worked brilliantly. They take Poland, they take parts of Western Europe. Eventually, France will fall. They essentially have the British on their knees. They never crossed the English Channel, but the British were hurting for sure. And up until they decided to attack the Soviet Union, the Germans really were winning World War II. In fact, honestly, the Germans were winning the war against the Russians as well, till you get to the winter of 1941. So Blitzkrieg was working. The German war effort was successful. They were defeating all their enemies on all fronts up to June of 1941. All right, Pearl Harbor and the U.S. entry into World War II. So you'll recall that the Japanese were starting to attack places like French Indochina. It's after French Indochina is conquered that the United States tells the Japanese, okay, that's enough. The United States threatens to put an oil embargo on Japan unless they remove their troops from French Indochina. So that threat of an oil embargo is what leads the Japanese to really see the Americans as a threat. And they decide to attack Pearl Harbor on December the 7th, 1941. You'll recall there were three waves of assault called for that day. The first assault took out the airfields and the aircraft on Hawaii. The second assault did a lot of damage to the Navy, battleships, destroyers, things like that were out at the anchored at Pearl Harbor. The third assault was called off, though, and it would have been a devastating attack had it been carried out, because the Japanese just couldn't figure out where America's aircraft carriers were. So that was a critical mistake. They did not knock Pearl Harbor out. They did not knock out the entire U.S. Pacific Fleet. And that meant that the United States was still able to fight back after the attack at Pearl Harbor. That's what leads the United States to declare war on Germany, looking at U.S. entry into World War II. You can go back and look. There's an entire slide that looks at the U.S. entering into the war, talking about home front production. Let's see. So, the United States is going to fight a global war on two fronts. That meant that the United States and its allies would need all these weapons of war. So, women signed up to work in factories. They built the aircraft, the tanks, the machine guns that would be needed to win the war. Our U.S. home front production was staggering. It had just outpaced the Axis powers. And yeah, the United States built the arsenal of democracy, built the various weapons that would be needed to fight around the world. And those weapons weren't just used by U.S. troops. A lot of those weapons were given to American allies as well in the Lend-Lease program throughout World War II. We also talked about the internment of Japanese Americans. Again, that fear that there would be spies here in the United States. So Japanese Americans were taken out to the middle of nowhere in New Mexico and forced to live in those camps. We talked about how African Americans signed up to serve in the war. Looked at the Tuskegee Airmen, looked at the Red Ball Express, so you should go back and look at those things too. Let's see, Navajo code talkers, Native Americans stepped up as well. So like I told you that day in lecture, it took every man, woman, and child in America, regardless of gender, race, creed, religion, to step up and do their part to try to win the war. You might also remember that there's something called the Big Three, right? The United States, the Soviet Union, and the British Empire. But the Big Three also it can mean the leaders of those countries. Franklin Roosevelt for the United States, Joseph Stalin for the Soviet Union, and Winston Churchill for the British. You might also remember your various conferences of World War II. Go back and look at what was talked about at Munich. The Munich Conference, the Tehran Conference, the Yalta Conference, as well as the Potsdam Conference. D-Day or Operation Overlord. So the Tehran Conference is where the Big Three discussed opening up a Western Front. Stalin really needed help taking pressure off the Soviet Union to the east. He needed the Americans and the British to cross the Channel in England, get into France, and open up a second front, a Western Front, against the Germans. D-Day was the opening up of that Western Front. It was the attack on June 6, 1944, into northern France. You can go back and look at the elaborate scheme. The paratroopers, the naval power, air power, the deception, and everything came down to that amphibious assault. And on D-Day, U.S. British forces did capture those beaches. They did secure that Western Front. So at that point, it really was the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany after the successful landings at D-Day and the Normandy invasions. Also recall in 1944, Italy will fall into Allied hands. France will be liberated. And by the end of 1944, Germany was completely surrounded. The Americans and the British on the Western Front, and then the Russians on the Eastern Front. In the middle of all that, the Yalta Conference was held. I told you it was a big conference. It's going to be on test 3. It'll be on test 4. You have decisions that were made for post-war Germany. Germany itself was going to be divided into 4 zones of occupation. The capital, Berlin, would also be divided into those 4 zones of occupation. Germany was also instead of paying money or reparations at the end of the war, Germany's technology would be stolen by the Allied powers. And that would sort of be their reparations. There were also decisions made for Eastern Europe. The United States and the British wanted Eastern Europe to be free, but Stalin disagreed. And Stalin made it clear that he was going to hold on to Eastern Europe at the end of World War II. We call that the betrayal at Yalta. And like I said in class, the Cold War starts right there with the Soviet Union saying that it's going to hold on to Eastern Europe at the end of the war. There was also a pledge by the Soviet Union to help with the fighting in Asia against Japan once Germany was defeated. And lastly, at Yalta, there was an agreement made to call for the United Nations that the U.S. would be a part of, and it would also be housed in New York City. Okay, ending World War II in Europe and in Asia. So ending the war in Europe really came down to invading Germany. You have, again, the Americans and the British coming in from the west, the Germans coming in from the east. By April of 1945, the Germans encircle Berlin, begin their final assaults. At the end of April 1945, Hitler takes his life. Then like a week later, on May the 7th, 1945, Victory Europe Day, Karl Dönitz, leader of the German Navy, surrenders his country to Dwight Eisenhower. So ending the war in Europe was about invading Germany, defeating it, and then the surrender on May the 7th, 1945. Ending the war in Asia was very different. Go back and look at the United States capturing the islands of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. That put U.S. Bombers within range of flying nonstop around the clock bombing missions over Japan. But it also showed in taking those two small islands the heavy casualties that the U.S. suffered. That led military experts to say that it would cost 1 million American casualties to capture the islands of Japan. So at that point, Truman had a tough decision to make. He could, on the one hand, invade the islands of Japan, lose a lot of American lives, and good Lord knows how many Japanese people would have died in an invasion of their homeland. You could surround the islands of Japan and sort of wait them out, lay siege to Japan, if you will. But again, the Japanese people were committed to kamikaze attacks. They probably would have carried out kamikaze attacks against American forces. Or the third option, you had the Manhattan Project, the building of an atomic bomb. Remember at Potsdam, the Allied forces met to discuss how to end the war against Japan. Also, it was agreed at Potsdam that the atomic bomb could be used to end the war. Go back and look at Truman had that horrible decision to make, his options as far as dropping the bomb. But then finally, he does agree the first bomb will be dropped on Hiroshima. Then you'll also recall that the Russians went on a land grab like the next day after Hiroshima to go and capture places like North Korea, Manchuria, things like that. The Japanese don't surrender there, so a few days later, a second device is used on Nagasaki. At that point, the Japanese agree to ceasefire to surrender. You have Victory Japan Day there on August the 14th, 1945. And then you have the war officially coming to an end on September the 2nd in Tokyo Bay on September the 2nd, 1945. So ending the war in Asia was different. It was about using the atomic bomb to end the fighting over there. All right, I really can't think of anything else right now. Don't forget about your conferences. Look at all these things I've talked about here in this review sheet. Man, I just can't think of anything else right off the top of my head. Anyways, study up. If you have any questions, send me an email, and talk to you later. Bye.